He introduced me at the company gala as just the wife who warmed his bed and dinners. The crowd chuckled. I kept my gaze low, humiliated, burning but silent. Then the CEO stepped forward, clapping me on the back. "We're thrilled to welcome our new head of global operations," he said. My husband froze. His smirk flickered, then vanished. "She's basically my personal chef and bed warmer," Brian announced to the corporate crowd. What he didn't know was that the board had already made their decision. About me. Not him. The words hung in the air like poison as 37 executives turned to look at me. Some smiled politely. Others chuckled. Margaret from accounting, the same woman who'd complimented my quarterly analysis last week, actually giggled behind her wine glass. I stood there in my navy dress, the one Brian had chosen because it made me look appropriate for corporate functions, watching faces I'd studied for years. These were people whose emails I'd answered, whose reports I'd ghostwritten, whose strategies I'd crafted during countless late nights while Brian watched television downstairs. "Brian, you're absolutely terrible," laughed Robert from finance, raising his whiskey toward my husband. "Where'd you find such a devoted one?" My wedding ring felt like it was cutting off circulation. The chandelier above cast sharp shadows across the marble floor, and I wanted nothing more than to disappear into one of them. This wasn't the first time Brian had reduced me to domestic functions in public, but something about tonight felt different. Final. "She's also excellent with my laundry," Brian continued, his voice growing bolder with each laugh he earned. "Really knows her way around a washing machine." The CEO, Liam Morrison, stood near the bar watching this performance with an expression I couldn't quite read. Our eyes met briefly across the room and something passed between us. Understanding, maybe. Or recognition. My cheeks burned as another wave of polite laughter rippled through the group. The woman standing next to me, someone from the Tokyo division, leaned closer and whispered, "You're so lucky to have found someone who appreciates the simple things." Lucky. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. "Well, we should all be so fortunate," said another voice. "A woman who knows her place in the world." Her place. My place apparently was heating up Brian's dinner and warming his bed. Not analyzing market trends or developing expansion strategies. Not the woman who'd single-handedly saved the Morrison account last quarter, or the one who'd identified the supply chain vulnerabilities that saved the company $2 million. "I think I need some air," I murmured, but nobody heard me. They were too busy enjoying Brian's comedy routine. I slipped away toward the bar, my heels clicking against the marble with each step. The bartender, a young woman with sympathetic eyes, poured champagne without me asking. "Rough evening," she whispered. "You could say that." The champagne tasted flat, watered down like everything else in my life had become. From across the ballroom I could see Brian still holding court, probably moving on to jokes about my grocery shopping skills or my ability to fold his shirts properly. That's when I felt a presence beside me. "Enjoying the festivities?" Liam's voice was quiet, almost conspiratorial. "It's been enlightening," I replied, choosing my words carefully. He studied my face with the same intensity he brought to board meetings. "I've been meaning to discuss the Peterson proposal with you." The board was particularly impressed with the risk assessment analysis. My heart stopped. The Peterson proposal, the one Brian had presented last month as his own work. The one I'd researched and written during 3 sleepless weeks while he attended golf tournaments with clients. "I'm glad it was well received," I managed. "Your projection models were remarkably sophisticated. We rarely see that level of strategic insight." Liam's eyes held mine steadily. "The board specifically noted the innovation in your market penetration strategies." The noise of the party faded into background static. He knew. Somehow this man knew exactly who had crafted that proposal. "There's something else," Liam continued, lowering his voice. "We've been discussing organizational restructuring. New leadership positions. The board believes fresh perspective is exactly what we need for our global expansion." He pressed a business card into my palm. "Call me Monday morning. We have much to discuss about your future here." Then he walked away, leaving me standing at the bar with trembling hands and a piece of cardstock that felt heavier than platinum. I spent the remainder of the evening watching Brian network and charm potential clients, completely oblivious to the conversation that had just altered the trajectory of everything. He introduced me to 4 more people as his better half, though we both knew which half actually did the thinking. During the taxi ride home, Brian chatted excitedly about his conversations with prospective investors. The alcohol had made him generous, almost affectionate. "You looked good tonight," he said, patting my knee condescendingly. "Nice to have you there for moral support." Moral support. The phrase echoed in my head as streetlights blurred past the window. Liam's business card was hidden in my purse like contraband, like evidence of a crime I hadn't yet committed. That night, I lay in bed listening to Brian's satisfied snoring. For 15 years I'd been the ghost author of his success story. I'd researched his presentations, written his proposals, and refined his ideas until they sparkled. I'd made him look brilliant while erasing myself completely. But tonight had crystallized something essential. The humiliation at the gala wasn't just embarrassment. It was revelation. I saw our entire marriage through new eyes. The gradual disappearance of my identity, the systematic dismissal of my contributions, the way I'd allowed myself to become background music in my own life. Liam's words replayed endlessly. "Your future here. Not Brian's future. Not our shared future. Mine alone." I slipped quietly from bed and retrieved the business card from my evening bag. In the moonlight filtering through our bedroom curtains, the embossed letters seemed to glow with possibility. Monday morning I would dial that number. Monday morning I would stop being Brian's invisible assistant and start reclaiming the woman I'd buried beneath years of silent service. The architect of his career was about to step out from behind the curtain. The gala had shattered something inside me, but it had also awakened something I'd forgotten existed. My own voice, my own ambition, my own undeniable worth. And for the first time in over a decade I wasn't afraid to claim them. Monday morning arrived with coffee that tasted like regret. I sat at our kitchen table, Liam's business card hidden beneath a stack of unpaid bills, watching Brian scroll through his phone while eating the breakfast I'd prepared without thinking. "Peterson wants to fast-track the Singapore expansion," he said, not looking up. "Looks like my proposal really impressed the board." My proposal. The words sat heavy in my throat, unspoken. It hadn't always been this way. 20 years ago Brian Mitchells had been the kind of man who made elevators feel smaller just by stepping inside. Broad shoulders, easy smile, the confidence that came from never doubting your place in the world. I was 23, working reception at Hartwell Industries, fresh from business school with dreams bigger than my paycheck. "You're wasted behind that desk," he told me at the company holiday party. "Someone with your brains should be running departments, not answering phones." Those words had felt like sunlight after years of professors who'd dismissed my questions and supervisors who'd handed me filing instead of opportunities. Brian saw potential where others saw a pretty face and fast typing skills. "Let me help you," he'd whispered during our third date, his hand covering mine across a candlelit table. "We could be unstoppable together." Marriage came fast. Within 18 months, I was Mrs. Brian Mitchells, trading my cramped studio apartment for his spacious townhouse and my entry-level position for what he called strategic planning from home. "Think of it as an investment," Brian had explained when I'd hesitated about leaving Hartwell. "You help me establish myself and then we'll have the resources for you to start your own consultancy. Partnership, not sacrifice." The plan made sense. Brian had energy and charm, but his presentations lacked depth. His analysis was surface level, his strategic thinking limited to quarterly targets. I had the analytical mind, the research skills, the ability to see patterns others missed. Our first collaboration was a market assessment for a potential client. Brian handled the schmoozing while I crafted the actual strategy. When they signed a 6-figure contract, we celebrated with champagne and plans for our future empire. "See," Brian had said, pulling me close in our living room. "We make a perfect team." Team. The word had meant something different then. The request started small. "Could you take a look at this proposal? Just clean up the language." Then they grew. "I need a full competitive analysis by Thursday." Eventually they became expectations. Brian would arrive home with manila folders full of half-formed ideas, dropping them on my desk like homework assignments. I didn't mind initially. Seeing my strategies succeed, watching Brian present concepts I'd developed. It felt like winning by proxy. When he got promoted to senior associate, I felt proud. When clients specifically requested his expertise, I felt accomplished. The Tokyo deal changed everything. Nakamura Industries wanted to expand into North American markets, but their previous consultants had failed spectacularly. Brian came home that Friday night practically vibrating with excitement. "This could be it," he'd said, loosening his tie. "The account that puts me on the partner track. But their requirements are insane. They want a complete market penetration strategy, risk assessments for 12 different sectors, and financial projections for a 5-year rollout." I spent 3 weeks researching Japanese business culture, analyzing currency fluctuations, and modeling scenarios that accounted for everything from political instability to natural disasters. My dining room table disappeared beneath spreadsheets and industry reports. I worked 18-hour days, surviving on coffee and determination. The night before Brian's presentation, I handed him a leather portfolio containing 60 pages of the most comprehensive strategic analysis I'd ever produced. Charts, graphs, projections, everything color-coded and cross-referenced. "This is incredible," he'd said, flipping through pages. "You've thought of everything." The next evening, Brian came home with a bottle of Dom Perignon and news that Nakamura had signed exclusively with his firm. His bonus was enough for a down payment on the house we'd been dreaming about. "We did it," he'd said, popping the cork. "This calls for celebration." But when he took his team to the steakhouse downtown the following weekend, I wasn't invited. When the company newsletter featured an article about his innovative approach to international expansion, my name appeared nowhere. When Nakamura so personally thanked Brian for his visionary insights, I was washing dishes in our new kitchen. That's when I started paying attention to the pronouns. My strategy secured the Henderson account. Not our strategy. My analysis identified the market gap. Not my analysis that he'd requested on a Tuesday and received on Thursday, fully formatted and footnoted. I tried speaking up once. David Chin from Brian's office had stopped by for dinner, and conversation turned to the Nakamura success. "You know," I'd said, refilling wine glasses, "I should start charging Brian consulting fees for all the research I do." The table went quiet. David laughed nervously. Brian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Later, after David left, Brian cornered me in the kitchen. His voice was calm, controlled, but his eyes held something cold I'd never seen before. "Don't ever embarrass me like that again." "I was just joking." "Were you?" "Because it sounded like you were trying to take credit for my work." "Your work." The words slipped out before I could stop them. "My client relationships. My presentations. My reputation." His voice dropped lower. "You help with research. That's not the same as closing deals or managing client expectations. Don't confuse support with leadership." I never made that mistake again. Years blended together after that. My skills sharpened while my visibility faded. I became fluent in market analysis, expert in strategic planning, masterful at transforming Brian's vague concepts into profitable realities. But my name never appeared on proposals. My insights never earned recognition. My contributions became background noise in the symphony of Brian's ascending career. The irony was perfect. The more successful I made him, the more invisible I became. Each promotion he earned was built on foundations I'd poured. Each accolade he received was for work I'd produced. Each step up his corporate ladder pushed me further into the shadows. I told myself it was temporary. That once Brian reached partner level, he'd have resources to elevate me too. That our success was shared even if the credit wasn't. But success changes people. Or maybe it just reveals who they always were. By the time Brian made senior partner, I'd become his personal think tank, ghostwriter, and research department all rolled into one. He'd hand me complex challenges like I was some kind of intellectual vending machine, expecting brilliant solutions to appear on schedule. The worst part wasn't the lack of recognition. It was watching myself disappear piece by piece, year by year, until I'd become exactly what Brian had introduced me as that night. Just the woman who kept his life comfortable and his career trajectory smooth. Until Liam's business card reminded me that I'd once been someone else entirely. Tuesday morning, Liam's business card was still burning a hole in my purse when Brian burst through the front door with his laptop bag slung over his shoulder and that familiar gleam in his eyes. "Cancel whatever you're doing today," he announced, dropping his briefcase on the kitchen counter. Something big just landed on my desk. I looked up from the financial newspapers I'd been reading, a habit I'd developed over the years to stay current with market trends. "What kind of big?" "Global Expansion Initiative. The board wants a comprehensive proposal for international market penetration." Brian loosened his tie, already settling into strategy mode. This could be the project that fast-tracks me to executive level. My coffee cup paused halfway to my lips. International expansion. Exactly the kind of complex, multi-layered challenge I'd been hoping to tackle for years. The kind of project that required deep market analysis, cultural understanding, and strategic foresight. Timeline? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. 3 weeks. But here's the thing, they want something revolutionary. Not just expansion plans, but a complete reimagining of how we approach global markets. Brian pulled out a manila folder and set it on the table. I need you to work your magic on this one. Inside the folder was a single sheet of paper with bullet points so basic they read like a first-year business student's brainstorm. Expand to Asia, increase market share, maximize profits. Nothing about cultural adaptation, regulatory challenges, or competitive landscape analysis. This is your starting point? I asked. Just the framework. You know how to flesh these things out. Brian was already heading toward the shower. Make it sing, okay? This one matters. As his footsteps echoed upstairs, I stared at that pathetic outline. After 20 years of building his career from the shadows, he still handed me blank canvases and expected masterpieces. But this time felt different. Liam's words from the gala echoed in my mind. We should talk about your real future. Maybe it was time to paint something for myself. I spent the next 2 weeks transforming that amateur sketch into something extraordinary. Not just market analysis, but a complete strategic framework for cultural integration. I researched regulatory environments in 12 different countries, analyzed consumer behavior patterns across 4 continents, and developed risk mitigation strategies for everything from currency fluctuations to political instability. The dining room became my war room. Charts covered every surface, showing demographic trends, economic projections, and competitive positioning. I interviewed suppliers in 3 different time zones, analyzed trade agreements most executives had never heard of, and identified market opportunities that traditional consulting firms consistently missed. But this time I did something different. This time I created 2 versions. The first was what Brian expected. A polished, professional proposal with his name in the header and his usual buzzword-heavy executive summary. Surface-level insights dressed up in corporate speak. The kind of presentation that looked impressive in PowerPoint but crumbled under serious scrutiny. The second version was mine. Real analysis. Genuine innovation. Strategies that could actually revolutionize how the company approached international markets. I included cultural adaptation protocols, partnership frameworks with local distributors, and financial models that accounted for long-term relationship building rather than short-term profit extraction. The difference was night and day. Brian's version read like a Wikipedia summary. Mine read like a blueprint for building an empire. Friday afternoon, I logged into the company's internal submission portal, a system I'd helped Brian navigate countless times but had never used under my own credentials. My hands shook as I uploaded my proposal under my employee profile, the one that listed me as administrative support, but had been quietly updated by HR to reflect my MBA and strategic planning certifications. Brian spent that weekend polishing his presentation, completely confident that I'd delivered my usual ghost-written masterpiece. He practiced in front of our bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie and perfecting his confident smile. This proposal is going to change everything, he told his reflection. The board's going to be blown away. I sat on our bed watching him rehearse talking points for strategies he'd never developed, using insights he'd never discovered. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Sunday evening he finally asked to review the final proposal. Just email it to me, he said, not looking up from his phone. I trust you got everything right. I sent him the basic version, the one filled with generic recommendations and recycled corporate wisdom. He skimmed it for maybe 10 minutes before closing his laptop. Perfect, he said. This is exactly what they want to hear. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes everything feel possible. Brian left early for a breakfast meeting, kissing my forehead and promising to celebrate his inevitable success that evening. 2 hours later my phone rang. Miss Carter? This is Liam Morrison's office. He'd like to see you this afternoon. 2 o'clock. The boardroom smelled like leather and ambition. Liam sat behind his massive oak desk, my proposals spread open in front of him like evidence in a trial. Close the door, he said quietly. I turned the lock, my heart hammering against my ribs. This proposal, he began, holding up the document, is remarkable. The cultural integration strategies alone are worth implementing immediately. Heat flooded my cheeks. Thank you. The question is, was this your work? The moment stretched between us like a bridge I either had to cross or burn. 20 years of silence had led to this single question. Yes, I said. Every word. Liam leaned back in his chair, studying my face with the same intensity he brought to merger negotiations. The board reviewed 2 proposals for this initiative. One was sophisticated, innovative, genuinely transformative. The other was... He paused diplomatically. Disappointing. My breath caught. 2 proposals? Your husband submitted something this morning that read like a first draft. Buzzwords and platitudes. No substance. Liam's smile was almost paternal. But this is the work of someone who understands global markets at a fundamental level. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the city skyline. We're not just looking for an expansion strategy, Ms. Carter. We're looking for the right person to lead that expansion. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The board has been discussing organizational restructuring. We need someone in Tokyo to oversee our Asian operations. Someone with fresh perspective and proven analytical skills. He turned back to me. Someone who actually wrote the proposal we're about to approve. My hands were trembling. What are you saying? I'm saying we'd like to offer you the position of head of global operations. Effective immediately. The room tilted slightly. Head of global operations. The exact title Brian had been chasing for 3 years. There's a formal announcement being prepared, Liam continued. But I wanted to speak with you first. Privately. Outside his office window, the city stretched endlessly in all directions. Somewhere in those buildings, Brian was probably having lunch with colleagues, still confident about his afternoon board presentation. When would you need an answer? I asked. Take the weekend, Liam said. But Ms. Carter? The board meets Monday morning. If you say yes, your first responsibility will be presenting this proposal yourself. I walked out of that boardroom carrying a secret that weighed more than gravity itself. For the first time in 20 years, someone wanted to hear my voice instead of hiding it. That evening, I sat in our living room watching Brian practice his presentation one final time, still completely unaware that the woman he'd spent decades silencing was about to speak louder than he ever had. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline silence that precedes earthquakes. I was making breakfast when Brian's phone buzzed with the company-wide email notification. He glanced at it absently while buttering his toast, then froze mid-spread. What the hell is this? His voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before. The butter knife clattered against his plate as he stared at his screen, reading and rereading the same message. I poured my coffee with steady hands, though my heart was performing gymnastics. What's what? This email. It says. He looked up at me, confusion creasing his forehead. It says you've been appointed head of global operations. The kitchen went completely still. Even the refrigerator's hum seemed to pause, waiting for my response. Yes, I said, taking a sip of coffee. I accepted the position Friday afternoon. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the neighbor's dog barking 3 houses away. Brian's face cycled through emotions like a broken slideshow. Confusion, disbelief, something approaching panic. Then he laughed. A short, sharp sound that had nothing to do with humor. That's impossible. There must be some mistake. He was already dialing his phone. I'll call Liam and get this sorted out. Brian. My voice was calmer than I felt. There's no mistake. But he wasn't listening. He was pacing our kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, waiting for someone to answer and fix this obvious clerical error. Liam? It's Brian. We need to talk about this email. What? No, I'm talking about the announcement. Yes, I understand she's qualified, but... I watched 20 years of condescension crumble in real time. Brian's confident tone faltered as whatever Liam was saying on the other end penetrated his certainty. But I submitted the proposal. What do you mean there were 2 versions? The metadata shows what? His face went pale. The phone trembled slightly in his grip. I need to come in, he said finally. We need to discuss this face to face. He hung up and stared at me like I'd suddenly grown a second head. You submitted your own proposal, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. While working on mine. While working on the version you thought you were submitting. I set down my coffee cup. The version with your name on strategies you never developed. For the first time in our marriage, Brian had no immediate response. He opened his mouth, closed it, then sat heavily in his chair. How long? He asked quietly. How long what? How long have you been planning this? The question revealed everything he still didn't understand. He thought this was about revenge, about some elaborate scheme to undermine him. He couldn't conceive that it might simply be about me finally stepping into the light I'd been hiding in for decades. I wasn't planning anything, Brian. I was just tired of being invisible. An hour later, he left for the office with the grim determination of a man preparing for battle. I knew he'd demand meetings, question the decision-making process, probably suggest that my proposal was somehow derivative of his work. I spent the morning cleaning our house with methodical precision, each task a meditation on the seismic shift happening in our lives. When I folded Brian's shirts, I wondered how many times I'd performed this exact routine while crafting the strategies that had built his career. My phone rang at 11:30. Margaret from accounting, her voice bright with excitement. Danielle. I just heard the news. Head of Global Operations. That's incredible. Thank you, Margaret. You know, I always suspected you were the brains behind Brian's success. The way you'd quietly correct details during company functions, or how you always seemed to know more about his projects than he did. She paused. I'm so glad you're finally getting the recognition you deserve. 3 more calls followed. Colleagues congratulating me, some admitting they'd suspected my involvement in Brian's work for years. Apparently, my invisibility hadn't been as complete as I'd thought. Brian came home at 4:30, 2 hours earlier than usual. His face was gray, his tie loosened like a noose that had been partially removed. Well? I asked. He sat at our kitchen table and stared at his hands. They showed me the submission timestamps. Your proposal was uploaded at 10:30 Friday morning. Mine went in at 8:15 Monday. And they ran both documents through plagiarism software. Yours was entirely original. Mine. He swallowed hard. Mine contained paragraphs from 3 different consulting white papers. Strategies you'd used in previous projects. The irony was perfect. While I'd been creating genuinely innovative content, Brian had been recycling my old work without even realizing it. Liam said the board has been watching our department for months. They noticed inconsistencies between the quality of my presentations and my written submissions. Brian's voice was barely a whisper. They knew. What happens now? I've been reassigned to regional account management, reporting to David Chin. He looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw genuine vulnerability in his eyes. David was my junior associate 3 years ago. The man who'd spent decades climbing corporate ladders had just been bumped down several rungs. Not fired. The company was too diplomatic for that, but demoted in the most elegant way possible. The Tokyo project? I asked. Yours now. Along with the team I've been managing for the past 5 years. He rubbed his forehead. Sarah Martinez will be your direct report. She used to work under me. Sarah Martinez. The brilliant analyst Brian had consistently overlooked for promotion despite her exceptional work. Another woman whose contributions had been systematically undervalued. I'm sorry this is difficult for you, I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, I didn't want Brian to suffer. I just wanted him to understand. Are you? He asked. Sorry, I mean? The question hung between us like a bridge we both had to decide whether to cross. I'm sorry you're hurting, I said carefully. But I'm not sorry. I finally spoke up. That evening we ate dinner in silence. Brian picked at his food while I reviewed the transition documents Liam had couriered over. Organizational charts, budget allocations, team assignments, all the infrastructure of the department I'd been secretly supporting for years. How does it feel? Brian asked suddenly. How does what feel? Having your name on something for once. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement he'd ever given me. Not an apology exactly, but recognition that my contributions had existed all along. Terrifying, I admitted. And exhilarating. He nodded slowly, as if processing information that challenged everything he'd believed about our relationship. Later that night, I found him in his study, staring at the wall where his diplomas and awards hung like monuments to a career I'd helped build. For the first time since I'd known him, Brian Mitchells looked genuinely lost. "What do I do now?" he asked without turning around. It was the first question he'd asked me in years that wasn't about research, analysis, or strategic planning. It was the first time he'd asked for my guidance as a person rather than demanding my labor as a resource. "You learn," I said. "You figure out who you are when you can't take credit for someone else's work." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, almost inaudibly, he said, "I never meant for it to go this far." "I know," I replied. And despite everything, I meant it. The man who'd introduced me as his personal chef and bedwarmer was finally beginning to understand that the woman he'd been dismissing for decades had just become his professional superior. For the first time in our marriage, Brian had nothing left to say. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need him to. Tuesday morning, I walked into the 32nd floor of Hartwell Industries for the first time as head of global operations. The elevator ride felt different when you weren't visiting someone else's office. When the key card in your hand opened doors instead of keeping you waiting in lobbies. "Miss Carter." A young woman with nervous energy and a tablet clutched against her chest appeared at my elbow. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, your executive assistant. Would you like me to show you to your office?" My office. The words still felt foreign, like trying on clothes that were simultaneously too big and perfectly fitted. The corner office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. My nameplate, Danielle Carter, head of global operations, gleamed on the door like a small miracle. Inside, everything was crisp and new. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, a conference table that could seat 12. "The team is eager to meet with you," Jennifer said, setting down a leather portfolio. "I've scheduled introductory meetings starting at 9:30. My team. People who would report to me, seek my guidance, implement my strategies." The concept was dizzying. The first meeting was with Sarah Martinez, the analyst Brian had consistently overlooked despite her exceptional work. She knocked tentatively, then stepped inside with the careful posture of someone accustomed to being dismissed. "Sarah, please sit." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "I've reviewed your portfolio. Your market analysis for the European expansion was remarkable." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You read my reports?" "Everyone. Your insights on consumer behavior patterns were exactly what the board needed to see." I leaned forward. "I want to discuss promoting you to senior strategic analyst." For a moment, Sarah looked like she might cry. "Mr. Mitchells always said my work was too theoretical. Not practical enough for executive review." Mr. Mitchells was wrong. The words felt powerful, definitive. "Your theoretical framework is precisely what transforms good strategies into exceptional ones." Over the next 2 hours, I met with 6 more team members. Each conversation revealed the same pattern. Brilliant minds constrained by limited recognition, innovative thinkers whose ideas had been filtered through Brian's conservative lens before reaching upper management. Marcus Chin, a junior analyst with groundbreaking ideas about cryptocurrency integration in international markets. Brian had shelved his proposals as too risky. Linda Torres, whose demographic research had identified untapped markets in South America. Brian had dismissed her findings as outside our current scope. By lunch, I understood exactly why Brian's department had been stagnating despite having access to extraordinary talent. He'd been sitting on a goldmine of innovation, too threatened by his team's capabilities to let them shine. "There's going to be some restructuring," I announced during our first team meeting. "I want fresh perspectives on everything we've been doing. Question our assumptions. Challenge our methodologies. Bring me ideas that make me uncomfortable." The room buzzed with an energy I hadn't felt in corporate settings before. These weren't people going through motions, they were minds finally given permission to engage. After the meeting, Sarah lingered behind. "Miss Carter, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "How did you do it? How did you go from being invisible to this?" She gestured around the office. The question hit deeper than I'd expected. "How do you explain 20 years of silence followed by one moment of speaking up?" "I stopped waiting for permission," I said finally. "I stopped believing that my value was determined by whether someone else acknowledged it." That afternoon, Liam stopped by with a stack of international contracts and a smile that suggested he was enjoying the company's newest success story. Early feedback from Tokyo is exceptional, he said, settling into one of my conference chairs. They're particularly impressed with your cultural sensitivity protocols. Nakamura Industries wants to fast-track the partnership discussion. Nakamura. The same company whose contract I'd researched and strategized years ago, only to watch Brian take credit for the entire relationship. There's something else, Liam continued. We're launching a mentorship program for emerging female leaders. The board wants you to spearhead the initiative. What would that involve? Identifying talented women throughout the company who might be underutilized. Providing guidance, advocacy, strategic development. His expression grew serious. Women who might be in situations similar to yours. The idea sent electricity through my chest. How many other brilliant minds were hidden behind administrative titles or overshadowed by male colleagues taking credit for their work? That evening I called the first name on my list. Rebecca Foster from the legal department. I'd noticed her sharp analysis during contract negotiations, the way she'd quietly corrected details that everyone else had missed. Rebecca, this is Danielle Carter. I wonder if you'd be interested in discussing your career development over coffee. 3 days later we sat in a downtown cafe while Rebecca shared a story that sounded achingly familiar. 5 years of writing briefs that her supervising partner presented as his own work. Brilliant legal strategies attributed to male colleagues. Ideas dismissed in meetings, then repeated by men who received credit for the innovation. I've been thinking about leaving the law entirely, Rebecca admitted. Maybe starting over somewhere else. What if you didn't have to leave? What if you just had to step forward? Over the following weeks, my informal mentorship expanded. Elena Rodriguez from marketing, whose campaign concepts had been consistently rebranded and claimed by her department head. Amanda Kim from finance, whose risk assessment models had prevented the company from making several costly mistakes, while her boss received recognition for prudent fiscal management. Each conversation revealed the same invisible architecture of suppression. Brilliant women whose contributions were systematically erased, repackaged, or minimized by the men positioned above them. The pattern is systemic, I told Liam during our monthly check-in. We're not just losing individual talent. We're losing entire generations of innovation. What do you recommend? Transparency. Metadata tracking on all collaborative projects. Individual attribution for strategic contributions. Performance reviews that account for actual work product, not just presentation skills. Liam nodded thoughtfully. Draw up a proposal. The board is ready to listen. At home, Brian and I navigated our new reality with the careful politeness of strangers sharing space. He'd stopped asking about my work after I'd gently deflected his third attempt to insert himself into my projects. Maybe we could collaborate again, he'd suggested over dinner the previous week. Pool our expertise. Like before. I'd asked, meeting his eyes across the table. When you were the face and I was the voice you never credited? He'd looked away, understanding finally registering in his expression. Now he came home from his regional accounts with stories I didn't ask about, while I stayed late reviewing proposals from women whose talents had been buried under years of systematic dismissal. The irony wasn't lost on me. Brian had spent decades reducing me to domestic functions while building his career on my intellectual labor. Now I was helping other women escape the same invisible prison he'd constructed around me. Saturday morning, I stood in what used to be my makeshift office, the spare bedroom where I'd written countless proposals that carried Brian's name. Boxes lined the walls, filled with research notes, strategic frameworks, and analysis reports that had never seen proper credit. I wasn't packing them away. I was reclaiming them. Each folder represented work I'd done in shadows, strategies I'd developed without recognition, innovations I'd created while pretending to be someone's assistant. This wasn't the past I was leaving behind. It was the foundation I was finally building upon. My nameplate might be new, but the mind behind it had been working toward this moment for 20 years. The woman who used to write from darkness had finally found her light. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sharing that light with anyone who hadn't earned it. 6 months after taking over the Global Operations Department, my assistant Jennifer knocked on my office door with an expression that mixed excitement and nervousness. Miss Carter, there's been a request from the National Women's Leadership Conference. They want you as a keynote speaker for their annual summit in Chicago. I looked up from the quarterly reports I'd been reviewing. Real reports now, with my signature at the bottom and my strategic vision guiding every recommendation. What's the theme? Breaking through corporate glass ceilings. Jennifer handed me a formal invitation printed on heavy cardstock. They specifically mentioned wanting someone who'd navigated significant career transformation. The invitation felt weighty in my hands, like holding a diploma I'd never thought I'd earn. Speaking publicly about my journey meant acknowledging the years of silence, the systematic erasure, the careful reconstruction of my professional identity. It meant telling a story I'd never spoken aloud. When is it? Next month. They're offering an honorarium, but... Jennifer paused. I think they're more interested in your voice than your fee. My voice. The thing that had been buried for decades under Brian's assumptions and my own compliance. That evening I sat in my home office, the room that had once been my secret workshop where I'd crafted Brian's career from the shadows. Now it was simply mine, with my books on the shelves and my certificates on the walls. I started writing the speech longhand, the way I used to draft strategies before typing them into presentations that would carry someone else's name. This time, every word would be attributed correctly. When they take your voice, write anyway. The title came to me as I stared out the window at the city lights, thinking about all the brilliant women I'd been mentoring who'd spent years whispering brilliant ideas to men who spoke them loudly. The speech took 2 weeks to perfect. Not because finding the words was difficult, but because choosing which truths to share required careful consideration. This wasn't about revenge or public humiliation. This was about recognition. Not just for me, but for every woman who'd ever been reduced to a supporting role in her own professional story. The conference was held at the Palmer House Hotel, in a ballroom that could seat 800 people. I stood backstage listening to my introduction, watching the audience through a gap in the curtain. Professional women of all ages, some accompanied by colleagues, others sitting alone with notebooks ready. Please welcome Danielle Carter, Head of Global Operations at Hartwell Industries. The applause was polite, expectant. They knew my current title but not the journey that had brought me to this podium. I began with a question: how many of you have ever had your ideas presented by someone else? Nearly every hand in the room went up. A ripple of recognition passed through the audience, the shared understanding of intellectual theft disguised as collaboration. For 20 years I was the ghostwriter of someone else's success story. I researched, analyzed, strategized, and innovated in silence while another person took credit for my work. My voice carried clearly through the ballroom, each word deliberate and measured. I told them about the proposals written in secret, the strategies developed without recognition, the systematic invisibility that had defined my professional existence. I didn't mention Brian's name. This story was bigger than one man's opportunism. The most insidious part wasn't the lack of credit, I continued. It was how I convinced myself that this was normal. That supporting someone else's ambition was the same as fulfilling my own. The audience was completely still, as if afraid that any movement might break the spell of honesty filling the room. I shared specific tactics: the importance of documenting contributions, the power of submitting original work under your own name, the necessity of speaking up even when your voice trembles. But mostly I talked about the moment when silence becomes more expensive than speaking. You don't need permission to use your own mind, I said, reaching the conclusion I'd rehearsed but still felt nervous delivering. You don't need someone else's validation to claim your own expertise. The pen was always in your hand, you just forgot you were allowed to write with it. The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. Women approached afterward with stories that mirrored my own. Decades of invisible labor, brilliant insights attributed to male colleagues, careers built in shadows while other people enjoyed the spotlight. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a researcher whose groundbreaking medical studies had been published under her department head's name for 15 years, shook my hand with tears in her eyes. I submitted my first solo paper last week, she whispered. Your story gave me the courage. Maria Santos, an architect whose building designs had been credited to her firm's senior partners, pressed her business card into my palm. I'm starting my own practice next month. Finally. As the evening wound down, I noticed Liam approaching with his characteristic quiet smile. Powerful speech, he said. The board watched the live stream. The whole board. Every member. They're particularly interested in expanding your mentorship program company-wide. His expression grew more serious. They want to conduct an audit of attribution practices across all departments. Root out any systematic issues with credit allocation. The implications were staggering. A complete review of how intellectual contributions were recognized and rewarded throughout the company. Protection for women like me who'd been building careers from the shadows. When do we start? Monday morning. You'll be working directly with our Chief Compliance Officer. That night, I called Rebecca Foster, the lawyer I'd been mentoring who'd been considering leaving the profession entirely. Rebecca? Turn on Channel 7. They're running a segment about the leadership conference. I watched from my living room as highlights from my speech aired on the evening news. The segment focused on workplace attribution issues, featuring interviews with women who'd attended the conference and decided to speak up about their own experiences. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Martinez. Saw you on the news. You're inspiring a revolution. Another message from Amanda Kim. My boss just asked if I'd be interested in presenting my own analysis to the executive committee. Thank you for showing us it was possible. The ripple effects continued for weeks. Women throughout the corporate world began demanding proper attribution for their work. Some companies responded with policy changes. Others faced uncomfortable questions about their promotion and recognition practices. Brian never mentioned the speech directly, though I knew he'd heard about it from colleagues. The few times he attempted conversation at home, his words carried a careful distance, as if he was speaking to someone he was just beginning to recognize. One evening, as I was reviewing applications for the expanded mentorship program, he appeared in my office doorway. Can I ask you something? His voice was quieter than I'd heard it in years. Of course. Do you regret it? The way things changed. I looked up from the stack of applications. Dozens of women requesting guidance, support, advocacy. Each folder represented someone ready to step out of the shadows and claim their own expertise. Which part would I regret? Finally being recognized for my work? Helping other women find their voices? Speaking the truth about what happened? He was quiet for a long moment. I meant, do you regret us? The question hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. I regret the version of us that required me to be invisible, I said carefully. But I don't regret becoming the person I was always meant to be. He nodded slowly as if processing information that challenged everything he'd believed about our relationship, our marriage, our shared history. The man who'd introduced me as his personal chef and bedwarmer was finally beginning to understand that the woman he'd systematically diminished had been the architect of everything he'd achieved. The irony was perfect. In trying to keep me small, Brian had missed watching me grow into exactly the person I'd always been capable of becoming. Me. I'd finally learned the most important lesson of all. I was never just anything. I was always enough. I simply needed to stop waiting for someone else to hand me permission to be myself. The conference had given me a platform, but the voice had always been mine. I'd just forgotten I was allowed to use it. If this story of ultimate professional revenge had you cheering for Danielle, smash that like button right now. My favorite part was when Brian realized his wife had just become his boss after years of taking credit for her work. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more empowering stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.